So we're on Canto 3, Chapter 14, Text 12 today, right? I think that's the same verse that I just... Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Jakshur Anmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamhayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakantvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gorangi Radhe Vrindavan Eshvari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. All right, so we are, as I understand it, on Canto 3, Chapter 14, Text 12, and we'll read this verse responsively. Bhartari apto rumananam Bhartari apto rumananam Lokam avishyate yashaha Lokan avishyate yashaha Patir bhavad vidho yasam Patir bhavad vidho yasam Prajayananujayate Prajayananujayate Bhartari apto rumananam Lokan avishyate yashaham Patir bhavad vidho yasam Prajayananujayate. Bhartari apto rumananam Kanam vishate yashaham yasam prajaya nanujayate bhartaryapto rumananam lokana vishate yashaha patir bhavad vidhoyasam prajaya nanujayate bhartaryapto rumananam lokana vishate yashaha patir bhavad vidhoyasam prajaya nanujayate. Ladies, Bhartari apto rumananam lokana vishate yashaha patir bhavad vidhoyasam prajaya nanujayate. Bhartari, by the husband. Apta urumananam, of those who are beloved. Lokan, in the world. Avishate, spreads. Yashaha, fame. Patihi, husband. Bhavat vidha, like your good self. Yasam, of those who. Prajaya, by children. Nanu, certainly. Jayate, expands. So this verse translates, a woman is honored in the world by the benediction of her husband, and a husband like you will become famous by having children, because you are meant for the expansion of living entities. This is going to sound like a strange request. Does anybody have a dime? I'm starting to charge for these classes, by the way. So this microphone is doing the thing where it gradually slides sideways because this screw right here is not tight, and a dime is the right. You have a screwdriver? Okay, great. That'll work also. Oh, you've got a one of those Swiss Army deals. Yeah, great. That'll get it. Thanks. Yeah. Oh, great. That's got it. Thanks. So, responsively, a woman is honored in the world by the benediction of her husband. And a husband like you will become famous by having children, because you are meant for the expansion of living entities. All right. A woman is honored in the world by the benediction of her husband, and a husband like you will become famous by having children, because you are meant for the expansion of living entities. So here's Prabhupada's purport. According to Rishabdev, one should not become a father or mother unless one is confident that he can beget children whom he can deliver from the clutches of birth and death. Human life is the only opportunity to get out of the material scene, which is full of the miseries of birth, death, old age, and diseases. Every human being should be given the opportunity to take advantage of this human form of life. And a father like Kasyap is supposed to beget good children for the purpose of liberation. Bhartaryapto rumananam lokana vishate yashaha patir bhavad vidho yasam prajaya nanujayate. A woman is honored in the world by the benediction of her husband, and a husband like you will become famous by having children, because you are meant for the expansion of living entities. As this chapter has been kind of an outgrowth of several chapters that preceded it, we are learning that really Kasyap Muni and his wives are the source of the largest percentage of the population of our universe. That's where mostly everybody comes from. Particularly the various bodily types. We learned, that Daksha gave 13 of his daughters to Kasyap, then later 4 more, making it 17, and then later 6 more came from somewhere else, making it 23 altogether. And so all these daughters with Kasyap Muni became the mothers of various types of creatures. We were saying the other day, Aditi is the mother of the demigods, Diti is the mother of the demons, Danu is the mother of the Danavas, and Kadru, the mother of various serpents, and Timi is the mother of, I forget, there's all these different daughters of Daksha. And this is where we get the various bodily forms as we see in the world around us, not the Darwinian concept that these forms were somehow generated from one another through natural selection and the process of random gene assembly. All right, so this is a very interesting subject because there's a lot of themes in this section, and I thought I would just sort of spell them out so that we can decide which path to go down. We have envy of others and what they have or what their accomplishments are, their goods and their accomplishments. We have, of course, this section is about sex attraction. And this section is about making mistakes. This section is about celibacy and family life. We could talk about a little bit the dhatus, the 7 dhatus, and maybe I'll get into talking about modern sex psychology and Sigmund Freud. So I want to put those before you, and then you all can tell me which path is more kind of interesting to go down, and we can kind of, because there's no time to talk about all these subjects. So, what's that? The dhatus. Freud. Okay. So, with the permission and blessing of Devamrita Swami, maybe we can say something, and we will proceed here. So it's interesting that Prabhupada always, he quotes in several places that there are 7 dhatus, and so it starts off with what's called rasa, which is, as far as I can understand it, roughly equivalent to blood plasma. So it takes a certain amount of rasa to make 1 drop of rakta, which is blood. So we start off with rasa, which I forget how many drops of rasa it takes to make 1 drop of rakta, blood. And then so many drops of rakta it takes, again, to make 1 drop of mamsa. Mamsa is muscle tissue and skin tissue. And it takes so many I forget, some kind of measurement of drops of, we'll just leave it with drops, of muscle tissue or mamsa to make mada, let's see what's it. I have it here, a cheat sheet. Meda. Meda is adipose tissue or fat. So certain amount of, muscle tissue it takes to make one little piece of fat tissue, and then a certain amount of meta it takes to make ashti. Ashti is bone material. So from muscle and fat we get bone, and then from bone we have maija, which is the bone marrow. And then from bone marrow, finally, we get to shukra, which is semina. So we have these various 7 dhatus, each one building to another. And that's why we have this concept that I will kind of talk about a little today, that the process in the human body is making up various constituents, one from the other, and each one is more difficult than the one that preceded it. So that's why when we get to the top, shukra or semina, that this is very difficult and precious material for the body. Now there is a complement in the female anatomy as well. I forgot how that works. It's explained in Brain Gain somewhere. So if you're interested, that's where some of this material is coming from. This book was compiled by Dhanavir Goswami, and he goes down a lot of interesting paths explaining about it. There's in the book, he starts off with a section by Maynard W. Bernard, who is a Jewish, rabbi who talked a lot about the importance of celibacy, and which is interesting. We'll talk a little bit about this today too. That it has not always been that the common medical and psychological opinion is that the more sex you have, the better off you are. That's certainly the modern common opinion. But this is a recent opinion, and it was turned around at one point from what everybody knew before, that the more sex you have, the worse off you are. It's not that way, But nevertheless, that's the way that generally our modern world sees things, both psychologists and medical practitioners, But Dr. Bernard, was a real champion of the idea that actually celibacy is good for both men and women, that it's a very important thing to maintain. And he speaks a little bit about Dr. Bernard, and then he talks about various celibate people. He explains these dhatus a little bit in the importance of conserving these things. And he talks about how at the last stage, when we're talking about sukra, it contains a lot of phosphorus compounds. And these phosphorus compounds and lipids are the kind of thing which are very key to myelin sheath. Myelin is the surrounding matter that goes around nerve tissue. So therefore, when one loses this shukra, then one's mental facilities become lessened. And so that's why for years, not years, literally millennium, most cultures understood that loss of semina or a comparable thing happens, in ladies as well. But at any rate, the idea is there that from losing this, one gradually becomes weaker in their mental process, and even various nerves and things become vitiated. And so it was known that when young men particularly masturbate, then they wind up losing a lot of semen. As a result, this creates the onset of various kinds of mental problems early in life, which was known up until recently, where, now it's seen the other way around. If you don't masturbate enough, then you're going to have mental problems, which is exactly the opposite of what the actual physical facts are, So this is our modern benediction we have of this upside down knowledge, that he describes these things, and he describes the basis of how various he takes it through connecting with various sages in our Vedic literature and Bhagavatam and so on, and how they explained about celibate life, et cetera, and how it's beneficial. And the semina either comes out, or if it's conserved, it goes up to the brain and strengthens not only the brain, but a number of chemical processes that occur in the body, and therefore, as a result of that, then we are benefited in many ways. There's a story about how I forget, was it Michelangelo that carved the famous statue of Mother Mary, I think, at one point. And so one famous person asked him that, he said that your depiction of Mary seems too young. And Michelangelo answered, is you have no idea of the power of celibacy. Interesting sort of anecdote. But at any rate, this idea of how sexual promiscuity is not only good but absolutely necessary is largely the outgrowth of, you probably already have guessed it, our friend Sigmund Freud, who is the benefactor of the world at large with many unfortunate and wrong-headed ideas. But he created a version of psychoanalysis, which to some extent is still working, although it's been modified and debunked by some people. He had a strong critic in his own granddaughter, Sophie Freud. But Freud had an interesting history because he felt, through his interacting with various patients that he saw, that people are basically completely messed up because of events that happened in their early childhood, and most of those were their longing for sex with their mother or father. He had evidently a strong attraction for his mother, and he assumed that this was universal. What's that verse? Atmavan jagate, what is it? Atmavan manyate jagat. Yeah, Atmavan manyate jagat. Right. So he felt that everyone must be like that. It's interesting that he was a strong proponent of the use of cocaine in medical procedures. That he himself was pretty much addicted to cocaine and to cigars. Which eventually wound up taking his life. He started smoking when he was fairly young, and graduated to where he was smoking 6 or 8 cigars every day, and that just can't be good for you. So eventually, in his later life, he developed mouth cancer. He had it operated on at one point, but later on it was too far gone, and as it got more and more painful for him, he connected with a doctor friend of his who he made a pact with, saying that at a certain point that the doctor would help him by giving him enough morphine that he would just go out. And so that's how Sigmund Freud left his body by overdose of morphine. So, gee, you know. But this idea has been now quite widely spread in society, both in medical circles and psychological circles, that one needs to have a lot of sexual contact, and that is normal, it's natural, and it's even necessary. That not to do that is damaging, you know. And this has had a great harm, because at one point it was known that a lot of times, for adolescents especially, what causes many mental problems is precisely this idea that people, especially young men, tend to masturbate, and as a result, this creates imbalances in the bodily system. This is wasting one of the most important fluids in the body, and as a result then it creates various kinds of mental destability, you know. There used to be a term, it was called dementia praecox. It's no longer in the PDF or PDM or whatever it is, PDR, that's what I'm trying to say. It's no longer listed as a condition or something treatable, but at one time it was. And generally people understood this, but now not so much anymore. And it's interesting, I was just thinking about this, you know, a couple of days ago, that we live in a time where basically nothing is shocking anymore, that on the internet or in movies or whatever you can see any kind of thing. But one thing is still shocking to people, and that is if you suggest that sex is not good for you. You know, I keep thinking of this verse in, seventh canto, Yan mai tunadi grihamedi sukham hitucham kandu yanena karayor dukkha. What is it? Yeah, kandutivan karayor eva dukkha dukkha tripyanti neha. What is it? Yeah, and the last one is, yeah, okay. So this verse explains that sex life is like rubbing together of two hands to relieve an itch. You know, already this is not very glamorous sounding, and I think this is actually shocking to people if they read this verse, you know, in the modern time, you know, that sex life is compared to two hands rubbing together to relieve an itch. And this is understood by kripanas, or miserly-minded people, as the greatest happiness, when actually it is the source of distress. When those who are actually dhira or sober, they tolerate this itching, and therefore they are not subjected to the sufferings of fools and rascals. So it's interesting this analogy is there, you know, and it certainly with, you know, sex life is not just people coming together for sex, you know. In our modern culture, sex life is kind of the center of culture. Movies are based on it, novels are based on it, popular portrayals of so many things are based on this kind of thing. You expect it, you see it everywhere, and, you know, it all boils down to, you know, this basic getting together, you know, of, men and women, largely for the idea of engaging in sex life, you know. And so this is seen as a grand thing, as a social thing, as an important cultural thing. And here Bhagavatam's describing it as two hands coming together to relieve an itch. So, and then we have pumsam striya maituni bhavametam tayor mito hridayam grantim ahu ato grihakshetra sutatta vitarjanasya moho aham mameti. So that verse is in 5th canto, and we have that the attraction between male and female is the basic principle of material life, based on this misconception which ties together the heart of the male and female. One becomes attached to body, home, property, children, relatives, and wealth. In this way, one increases life's illusions and always thinks in terms of I and mine. So, as Vaishnavas, we are not against marriage or against men and women coming together and properly executing the duties of grihastha life. That's generally the path most people will follow. But at the same time, even if you are in the grihastha ashram or contemplating to be in the grihastha ashram, it helps to understand this at the highest level, that ultimately this whole family thing is kind of a concession, and one has duties. But in the ultimate issue, we are individuals, we have our spiritual life, and that is the most important thing. And towards the end of it, to the end of our time on this planet, the husband and wife will detach themselves, or they should make a plan in that way, to detach themselves from whatever business or occupational commitments they had made, and start to move away from commitments to children, because by that time the children should have been already grown up and able to manage on their own. And if there is some occupation or business for the family, then the children can take that over. And then the husband and wife can travel. Traditionally in Vedic culture, that meant that the husband and wife traveled to holy places and engaged in cultivating the idea that soon they would both be leaving the planet, and trying to understand their relationship with the Supreme Lord, and thinking about minimizing their material desires, and certainly not entangling themselves anymore in household affairs of any kind. So that was the kind of thing. Technically, even sannyas is not necessary if instead the husband and wife are engaged in practical preaching activities, outreach to help people. So that's kind of the target, that the husband and wife help each other during the time when they're married and the children are growing up and they have all their struggles for finance and creating the nest, making it work. Then gradually, as they get older, the children get older, those necessities become minimized, and there should be a focus on helping to make other people Krishna conscious, which actually works really well if you have husband and wife teams. Prabhupada even mentioned that at one point, that more than even the sannyasis, his grihastas were the ones that spread, Krishna consciousness. So this is actually a good facility, provided that one does not get lost. And it's so easy to get lost in all the demands of grihastha life. So that's one of the parts that we get. So there's a lot more things I could say, but for time, I want to get some feedback from questions you all might have, or directions we might go, or maybe Devamrita Swami would like to add something to.
Well, all I can say about the subject matter is to repeat advice my mother gave me when I was 9 or 10 years old. advice I never had an opportunity to use. She said, always remember, son, romance without finance is a nuisance.
All right, Krishna Maharaj, I was just thinking about this point. You were mentioning the glorious characteristics of Sigmund Freud and his character. So I was thinking, how is it possible that people nowadays it just they don't look at the character of the person, giving them the supposed knowledge that they're receiving? Because it just seems, if you look at teachers in universities or these great theologians or whatever it may be, it just seems like that point is just completely just negated. He may be whatever he was, a wreck in his own personal life, and then they accept whatever they're presenting as something so valuable.
Well, that's the whole idea that, first of all, when somebody says something that's materially attractive to the world, people tend to not look very closely at their own character. Druta Karma and our Sariputta talked about a knowledge filter, and if something jives with the general consensus of what people want to hear, they tend to just sugarcoat it and look at it absolutely the most favorable kind of angle. On the other side of the coin, if something cuts against what the general consensus is, then it's scrutinized with very fine, microscopes to find any slight burr or, cinder in there anywhere, something that's unwanted, So I think that's partly it, If you study any of these, I've been reading on various philosophers. Practically every one of them are people you would not really want to know. And certainly most of the time their lives didn't end nicely. They either committed suicide or had some kind of weird thing. So you think if somebody's got a philosophy of life and they wind up committing suicide, what does it say about their philosophy of life, But one thing Sigmund Freud said that I found very interesting is he made the comment one time that life is like a tiny island of pain in the middle of a vast sea of indifference, which, certainly if you're not connected to the Supreme Lord, that's a good, kind of sums it up there, that life is like a tiny island of pain in a vast sea of indifference because, people are fighting their own battles and, you've got your battle. And in material life, especially if you're engaged in sinful activities, you're going to rack up more and more karma. And as you rack up more and more karma, you're certainly not going to experience ecstasies when you get older. You're going to experience the opposite of ecstasies when you get older. So, and then it all seems like a cruel joke, the whole of life, Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in its petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow. It's like a poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. Like a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Shakespeare really nailed that one, so that's, of course, Macbeth, But for someone who cuts themselves off from any connection with spiritual life. That's actually the way life seems, like a tale told by an idiot, like somebody on a stage not knowing their lines or what they're doing, we see that life's but a walking shadow. That's kind of the idea. So these things are sometimes ruminated on by people in our everyday modern world, but for the most part, people try to put these things out of their minds, and they look at things that distract them. That's why we are so preoccupied with the entertainment industry these days, which provides necessary distraction so that we can continue to distract ourselves from the darker and painful aspects of life, which become more and more painful as the years cross on, as our karma gets darker, because we don't know what we're doing. And we don't have anything to look for as solace in any kind of direction. Any other? Yes, Arjun.
Hare Krishna Maharaj. I have had a couple of students come up and ask about why the Vedic literatures or even the ancient Sanskrit literature, they actually depict a lot of erotic, say for example some of the temples in India.
The what?
Some of the temples in India, so they have some sort of obscene architecture on their, some obscene design on their architectures, or there are certain stories of betrayal, like Indra cheating on, so there's so many things like that. So many people, especially online, and that's where the students also get their, that's where they always refer to for understanding anything. So the online people, they actually explain how the Vedic literature is full of erotic things, and therefore we have to reject the Vedas, So something like that. So how can we actually, what kind of understanding can we give them? Because these things do exist in the Vedic literature.
That's interesting, because the other day we were talking about Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati, and I forget, in this 70s or 60s, no, it had to be earlier than that, because Bhakti Siddhanta left in 36 or whatever it was. So at one point, it must have been in the late 30s, that there was a professor. He was, I think, a interreligious dialogue professor of Ohio State University named Suthers. And Suthers was traveling in India, and he wanted to meet Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati. So there was an arrangement, and the two met in Krishnanagar. And that was one of the questions he asked Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati. He said, what about these indecent statues and things in various Vedic temples and things like that? I forget exactly how Bhakti Siddhanta answered that, but he went on a bit about how the Vedic system is designed actually to minimize thinking about things in a carnal, in a abusive way. That's basically what the Vedic system is designed to do. Now, there are, in general, you don't see much of that, but it does happen in some places that there are various, usually engravings, sometimes other kinds of artwork, but the purpose, of course, is that we're really looking at some other theme. We're not trying to, when you see, nudity, or you see some kind of portrayal like that in Western art or in Western sculpture. Certainly, the erotic aspect is not incidental. It's the very purpose of that art. It's the thing that the artist was trying to do. As we all know, sex sells. So, but in Vedic, in the Vedic portrayal in artistic creations, that's never the real purpose. Sometimes we see, like for instance, a picture of Krishna pulling the air out of Putana's breast, and her breasts are visible. In general, in the Western world, that would be considered, somehow obscene or something like that. But the purpose isn't to attract us to Putina's breasts. The purpose of it is to actually, show Krishna and the pastime in the way it occurred. It's incidental. And in general, because Indian culture is not as, maniacally, erotically preoccupied the way that Western culture is erotically preoccupied, that people don't even make that connection that way, whereas in the Western, we're, and it seems to me kind of such a, ironic thing, that in the Western world, the purpose of all art and culture generally to highlight erotic themes. That's almost the purpose of all of it, And people are okay with that, But, in Vedic culture, when something is a little bit, it shows a body part or something like that, then we start to wonder whether there's some, ulterior motivation in it, which really there isn't. It's just incidental. But that's, how I would respond to that. Maybe David Riktaswamy would have something else to say about it.
Well, those sculptures and artwork of various denizens and nymphs are showing you what life is basically about, even in the heavenly planets. It's all the same.
Same old.
Of course, we read in the Bhagavatam that the sense gratification on the heavenly planets is basically the same as on this earth planet, but 1,000 times more intense. But it's basically the same old. It just gives a more substantial, gratificatory experience. Still, there is the presence of time in the heavenly There's the presence of time in the heavenly planets, which brings everything to an end, and therefore there's anxiety even in the heavenly planets. Therefore Krishna assures you in Bhagavad Gita, Abrahma Bhuvana Loka, Puna Avartino Arjuna, from the highest planet, Brahma, down to the lowest, all are places of misery. But then you look at those sculptures and with mundane consciousness and think, ooh. Mm-hmm. But the point is, there are so many beings, so many human and human-like entities that exist in the universe, and the same business is going on. Just ask Nalakuvara Manigriva before Damodar Leela. Hare Krishna.
There's a comment from Hansarupa Prabhu. He was
Who?
Hansarupa Prabhu.
Oh, good.
He was discussing with Gaur Govinda Maharaj and Bhagavat Prabhu, and they were asking because in Bhubaneswar there's this erotica generally in many of the temples. They're known for that. And one explanation given was the outside of the temple structure represents the material universe, and you have to pass through that realm of Maya to enter the sanctorum to be with Krishna. Like you go from that, material universe. So it's your choice, either Maya or Krishna.
Otherwise, you stay out there, right? Just oogle the you never make it to the inside. I think that's something that would shock a lot of Christians and probably even other Judeo, religious adherents is the idea that there's sex even in the heavenly planets. That I think it's interesting that Mark Twain wrote one time in a group of writings that were called Letters from the Earth, and he wrote that I've never gone to a harp concert, and I think most people are not particularly interested in learning or hearing people play the harp. Yet in heaven we find that people are playing harps. And he said also, when a minister is speaking, if he speaks a little too long, then people start getting antsy and wish he would just finally wind up and get off the podium, so they could get down and mingle and have their food, He said, and what's peculiar most is that how much sex is at the center of what everybody wants, yet there's no mention of it in heaven, so we're here as a Vedic culture to say, Mark Twain, you were wrong. You just never read the Vedic literatures. But obviously, if one wants to enjoy materially, as we were saying the other day, sex life is adi ras. It is the most powerful of all the enjoyments in the material world. So how could it not be represented in the heavenly worlds if that's where people are going for enjoyment? And that's why we don't recommend going to the heavenly worlds. Rather, we want to go past to beyond the Brahmajyoti, to the spiritual world, to Vaikuntha, to Krishna Loka, where everyone is serving Krishna. So that's interesting.
I have here also the response of Professor Albert E. Suthers by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. So I'll read both. Did the worshippers of Krishna encourage the obscenity of the engravings on many Hindu temples? And the answer from Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. Those who are actual worshippers of Krishna are never in favor of indecencies. All decency and morality only are entirely confined to the lotus feet of Sri Krishna. The highest sense of morality of the unadulterated soul consists in its love towards the oversoul. And the culmination of this pure love is found only in the devotees of Krishna. The best of the moral rules as preached by the noble Jesus do not come anywhere near the principle of the amorous love of the devotees of Krishna for service thereof.
Yeah, and then he goes on to say they're like pygmies. Any other final questions before we wrap it up here this morning? Oh, this is a very interesting chapter. It brings out a lot of different issues, about making mistakes, about family life, about doing things at the wrong time, about the pitfalls of sex attraction, and particularly envy too. That's something that's there. We find that more even than deities wanting to have sex, she was feeling that she was not respected or given the same facility as her co-wives, which all had children at that point. So that was something that our Natavar mentioned yesterday. So that's an interesting thing too. So thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavatam. All glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.